So I gather you had a great conversation earlier in the conference.
It's been a wonderful conference. Okay. Wonderful conference. We had the first day, which is O'Reilly's Jumpstart program, is how do you apply big data to business, and it was a packed room all day long, and it was amazing to see that 1/3 of the people in that room had an MBA. So we're starting to attract some business people to really understand big data.
Now, and this is your sweet spot, right?
It is.
Right. You formerly were an executive at Pepsi, correct?
Yes.
You're a CIO in Latin America there?
Correct.
Right. So in that context, what are the 3 data-driven skills that every executive should be able to have and apply? And why does that matter?
Right. The first one is understanding that data is a strategic asset. You know, you look at data and you say, well, data is a raw material like capital, like people, like labor. So when you plan for your raw materials that are going to make your business successful, you need to include that. So I really work with executives to do strategic data planning, not as a byproduct, but as a main raw material for the business. So I think that's the first one, a strategic view of data. Okay. The other one is analytical skills. And I'm not saying CEOs need to become analysts. They need to think analytically. They need to be able to understand the data and make good decisions. There was a book called Why Decision Fails by Dr. Paul Nutt. Okay. Studied 400 managers and the decisions they made. It was incredible. Over 50% of the decisions looking back failed. And the reason is they were based on intuition. And sometimes we trust our gut more than we should. And maybe the data was not available, or maybe they didn't have the discipline, but we need to have that analytical discipline.
Does this mean that Malcolm Gladwell's hypothesis around blink is a little bit off in terms of going with your gut?
I think that, no, it's not off, it's complementary, and I'll tell you why. You start with data, and that's kind of the first level. Then you move that to information, and to knowledge, and to wisdom. But the wisdom is based on an empirical data set. We're not saying look at data and automatically make a decision, but I'm saying the starting point of the decision needs to be the data. Right? We're never going to replace a smart CEO, a smart chief marketing officer, right? Their knowledge over 20 years cannot be captured in an algorithm, okay? But we're saying if the starting point is not data, you're much more likely to make the wrong decision.
Got it. Okay, so this actually reflects something that I heard from Robert Kirkpatrick, who does a UN Global Pulse. And he in thinking about the role of data in decision making, I think said you need to use the power of the algorithm, the wisdom of the crowds, and the intuition of the expert.
Absolutely.
So to put those all together.
I would agree with that 100%.
It struck me as a good insight.
It is a great insight.
So to make this more concrete, what are some examples of better data-driven decision making from your career or from what you're seeing?
I'll share with you my example. It's my favorite example, which is Procter & Gamble. I'm a consumer products guy, spent many years in PepsiCo, and I am just really amazed with what Procter & Gamble's doing. Many businesses are naturally digital, right? And here in the Valley, a lot of people have digital businesses. So you run your business through the internet. Well, there's a lot of businesses that are not, right? So one of the questions is being data-driven just for Silicon Valley? And the answer is not. So we have Procter & Gamble, $84 billion company. They sell consumer products, so they sell soap in 80 different countries, right? How can you make that data-driven, okay? So Bob McDonald, the CEO, had a vision to capture the data, to digitize the company from the molecule in the lab to the point of sale, right? In India and all over the world, and then to make that data available throughout the organization, okay? The project's called Business Sphere. So very specifically, they collected this data, and now they have 8 foot by 32 feet screens where they report the data in their Monday morning staff meeting. And it's not static data. They can look at the data and say, okay, based on the data that I received from this week, am I likely to make my target? Or do I need to sell 500,000 cases more of shampoo or soap? And they can also drill down to a lower level of understanding why. So they divide the analytics into what, why, and actions, okay? And really that transforms now here's the other part that is just phenomenal. You don't want the ivory tower people looking at the data. You want that to be at the execution level. Over 40 locations have access to that very same data. 40 locations look at the same thing that the CEO looks at. And then the rest of the organization can look at it through a product called Cockpit, which is a web-based tool that lets you see the data for their part of the organization. So the time from insight to execution, giving that everybody's on the same page, is absolutely phenomenal. So I would encourage people that are looking for a good case study that is not the traditional Facebook and LinkedIn case studies, but is looking for a traditional company this is a phenomenal job. And they did this, by the way, before even big data. I mean, they understood that data was a strategic asset. So that's a very practical way of how you could transform your management meetings, the way you communicate worldwide.
So I see stories with some frequency about people who follow their GPS devices, follow their smartphones into walls, into dead ends, into cul-de-sacs, sometimes into highways. I think there was a great or instructive story about lorry drivers in Britain driving into places they couldn't go, right? Because they are following their devices, which are driven by data, making decisions. So that's I think a potential metaphor for a lot of what could be happening in this space. How can and where can data-driven decisions go wrong? What if the data is bad?
Yeah, it can go wrong in a number of different ways. One, if you have bad data. Two, if you don't use common sense, right? In your driving algorithm or example, so I'm driving and I know I'm going to a large Marriott hotel in Orlando, and I'm driving and I don't see any big buildings, and I'm going away from Orlando, maybe I'm going the wrong way, right? So it's one of those common sense things to look up and make sure that the data is supported by reality. We're not going to lose our common sense, our ability to make decisions based on 20, 30 years of knowing a business. So I would recommend for the GPS people, look up.
That's always a good example of something we all should be doing a little bit more, I know.
Yes, look up, common sense, very uncommon.
Most conferences these days, everyone is like this, so look
up
a little bit more. Okay, that's a good piece of advice. So last question, and this is, I think, something you already answered to some extent with that answer. What are the best ways to cut through the clutter, all that noise, rapidly expanding noise, to what matters and what we need to know? How can we make sure that we don't become too siloed in using these dashboards and using these other means to make decisions, to miss other signals that might be beyond what we're looking at right in front of us?
Absolutely.
Or right here?
Number one thing that I would advise people is don't start with the data. Start with the business objective. Bob McDonald had a big business objective that he wanted 1 billion customers in 5 years. That's a big goal. And he needed to use everything he had, including the data, okay? So if you start with a strategic business objective or just an immediate business objective and then work into the data, it's much better. Not to say that sometimes you cannot uncover things in data, but you've got to start with a purpose. Otherwise, you're likely to get lost.
Okay, that's good advice. So thank you very much for joining me.
Alex, good talking to you today.
Okay, so Diego Saenz, he's the president of the Datadriven CEO. You can read a great interview with him by a friend John Bruner over at Forbes, and certainly you can check out his work online as well.